I have not only delight to share with Jason's continuing wonderful series, but also with another announcement, which is that our friend Bruce Herman has a fantastic new book out as of Tuesday. It's coming out on the 21st. And it's called Makers by Nature, and it is wonderful. The official book launch will be at 7 p.m. on Tuesday, January 28th at Gordon College in the Ken Olson Science Center. There will be a dialogue between Bruce and myself and a presentation with slides by Bruce, and audience participation, and book signing, and refreshments. So I hope all of you can be there. I did post it on social media, and I think you did too, right, Bruce? But if anybody has not seen that announcement and wants to, please speak with me, and I'm happy to send you more information. The event is free, but we would be grateful for people to register in advance, or I should say Gordon College would be grateful. And if there will be an announcement in next week's bulletin, because I'm going to make sure that happens, and we're sorry it's not in today's. Okie doke? Thanks, and on to Jason. Thank you.
It does work as a good introduction. Well, welcome back. Good morning. A little less jet lag than last week, I do say. So I am feeling much more up to the task, but looking forward to kind of continuing our series on the New Testament world. Today I want to look specifically at kind of Greco-Roman religion. Last week, if you were here, we looked at a passage, and we'll see it again today just a little bit, where a response in Acts to what Paul and Barnabas do is to treat them as gods, as Zeus and Hermes. And we kind of looked at that a little bit and wondered why that was the reaction. Today we're going to go a little bit further into that and see how the ancients thought about religion. In the book of 1 Thessalonians, Paul praises the community. He says, "You turned from idols to serve the living God." And one of the things that we would be remiss to not note is that when Paul works as an apostle to the Gentiles, he is largely working in Greco-Roman settings. As we'll see today, people who are not raised with the Torah or the Ten Commandments or monotheism, and this radically shapes kind of the world that he enters into, and I think makes a lot of his work much more challenging than we might anticipate. And so that's my goal today, is to just showcase a little bit about how the ancients thought about religion, show a couple examples of some of the gods that were worshipped, and then third, think about how the early Christian story kind of intersects with that, and what the what the challenges were for Paul and the earliest Christians. Let me pray for us first, then we'll dive on in. Heavenly Father, Lord, we thank you for this morning. We thank you for the chance to gather and to learn. We thank you for the witness of your people in time past to the challenges of their world, and we pray that you would meet us today in our own. And we praise your name. Amen. All right, so when we think about religion in the Roman world, there was a kind of older mindset that the ancients kind of faked it till they maked it, and that this was kind of just silly things that no one really believed in. More recent research has actually kind of done the opposite and said, no, this is just part of the ancient world. They truly believe in the gods and what they were doing. We have lots of good quotes. We could showcase many, but Cicero says, "We Romans are far superior in religio," we get our word religion from there, by which I mean the worship of the gods, the cultus deorum. And then from Livy, we have a city that is Rome, founded on auspices and augury. There's no place in our city that is not filled with a sense of religion and the gods. And so as we begin, one of the first things to realize is that religion is everywhere in the ancient world. It is part of just the air that they breathe. But importantly, religion is not kind of a domesticated, sectioned off part of someone's life. As many of us probably know, the social, political, religious all interweave and intertwine with one another, so that you don't have like religion over here and your public life over here. That's a rather more modern and invention, the separation of church and state, as we might call it, is a rather recent innovation in human history, and not any of the ways that the ancients would have thought. I mentioned this text a little bit ago. This is the one from Acts 14, where the people respond to Paul and Barnabas' actions by declaring them to be gods who've reappeared in human form, Hermes and Zeus. And this really gets us at the ways in which ancients thought about their world, that there wasn't, as I mentioned, just healings over here and kind of public life over here. Obviously, throughout the book of Acts, we have a lot of intersections on the nature of economics, society, religion. Remember in Acts 19, there's a great riot in Ephesus because of Paul and his companions' actions where they're pulling people out of the ancient temples. And the silversmiths there in Ephesus get really upset and say our business is literally going up in flames. And now the city is at risk for kind of cosmic danger, divine danger response from the gods. As we think about religion, this gets us into some of the more basic elements. A lot of ancients recognized deities by their actions in the world. And so there was a sense in which everyone believed in the gods because they believed that they were surrounded by a multitude of supernatural beings. Some good, some bad, some indifferent to human experience. But they believed that they could see God's actions in the world, the gods' actions, by just looking around. The closest analogy that I have for this, to get us back into the sandals of the ancient person, is the sense of they've never seen the gods other than an idol, but they've seen the actions of God in the world. And so when they see storms, when they see cosmic upheaval, when they see misfortune, those are actually examples of the gods at work. A rough analogy, I think, and we can poke holes through this, so feel free to, is the concept of anger, right? Anger is not something that we have ever seen, right? You can't go on Amazon and order a box of anger, I don't think, yet. But we have all seen the effects of anger, right? Anger is a very real thing. We've seen someone yell, we've seen someone strike someone, and in some ways that's the closest analogy to the way ancient deities kind of function. They've never seen Zeus, they've never seen Poseidon, but they've seen the effects of Poseidon in the world. They've seen a storm sink their ship, right? And so for them, that's the way that they're thinking about how these divine beings function. The divine is obviously distinguished, and this has overlaps with Judaism and Christianity, with immortality. The gods always exist, they don't die, humans die, or at least need an afterlife, right? So humans are limited by immortality, the divine are not. And they also believe that the gods were intervening in human affairs. So there isn't, as I mentioned, a separation, but the gods are always intersecting, overlapping, intruding in some ways on human experience. And so then the goal then of ancient religion was to win the gods' favor, to get divine positive responses, and to avoid the gods' wrath or anger, right? If anyone has read through the classics, right, the Greek and Roman gods are often vindictive, right? They lash out, they respond negatively, and so the goal of that was to be on their good side, right? To find out what they needed, typically prayers and sacrifices, and to pay attention to that so as to win their favor. And so salvation, which is a word used throughout the Greco-Roman world, usually has a lot to deal with kind of this worldly matters. The word salvation often deals with the realms of like health and wellness. So oftentimes as someone recovers from sickness, they would use the language of salvation. I was saved, right? I was rescued from death. I was restored to health. That's how a lot of Roman salvation language functions. In fact, some of the Gospels, right, when Jesus heals somebody, they'll say, I was saved. I was restored by the gods. And so as the ancients thought about this, the goal of most religion then was to get the gods on the good side, to figure out what they needed and to pay right attention to that, to make sure that they were happy. And so we get this idea of reciprocity, mutual benefit. We give to the gods and the gods give to us. It's a two-way street. And so we give them adoration, worship, attention, and they figure out how to keep our lives peaceful. A lot of Roman religion was about stability, not just at like a civic level, like a city level, but also at an individual level. Was to make sure that life was stable and peaceful. And so because of this, every aspect of human life could be protected by appropriate attention to a certain deity. And these were worshipped at local shrines. They have gods for everything. I mean, as you see in the book of Acts, right? Paul, when he gets to Athens, sees all the idols and says there's even a statue to the unknown God, right? Lots of idols. Because they believed that different deities had domains over various aspects, from agriculture to childbearing to your job. There are deities for different occupations in the ancient world. And so religion is just part of everything. And so your goal is to make sure that you are attuned to that and giving right homage and worship through prayers, sacrifices, and attention. To give us somewhat of an analogy for that, so this works because it's actually, this analogy is not working in undergrad anymore because time has moved on. But there was a time when we didn't have this thing in my pocket. This is hard sometimes for undergrads to imagine not having cell phones, but we all realize that. And I'm a big Apple fan, so I'm actually a pretty big Apple nerd. If you come to my house, the password for our Wi-Fi is Steve Jobs. So that's a little bit about my life. Really. So I love Apple things, and so I've watched them for a long time. And when this first came out, right, it was a new technology being introduced to our lives. And Apple had a marketing campaign for this to get us to see, how we now know, that this would come to dominate every aspect of our daily life. So if you're at a restaurant, there's a calculator for tips. If you're going somewhere, there's a map to get you there. Your diary, your schedule is kept on here. And their tagline, when they first came out with this, was there's an app for that. Does anyone remember that marketing campaign, right? Because what they were trying to get you to see is that this device can help you in every domain of your daily life. And for us as ancients, right, we had to be convinced of that. Of like, oh yeah, you're right. And now we look back and go, oh wow, they were right. There is an app for that. There's an app for everything. My grandfather got a pacemaker, and there's an app for his pacemaker. So I mean, literally, there's an app for everything, right? Now, obviously, in ancient world, they don't have iPhones, but they have gods, and the tagline would be, there's a god for that, right? Every aspect of your life has some sort of deity around it to help it function, to help it go well. And so if you have problems, you find a deity and you go pray to them. You ask for something. And so if you are looking for a relationship, there's Aphrodite and Venus, and you're lonely and you need a partner. You could go to the temple and offer a prayer to the priest and offer a sacrifice and say, Aphrodite, Venus, bring me someone to go through life with. Or if you're upset at someone, there's another god for that, right? So there's ways to pay attention to deities to get things in your life, and also to make sure things don't go poorly, right? And so in the ancient world, if your house burns down or if your ship wrecks, right, that's less of a scientific answer of you're really bad at navigation or your boat really stinks, right? As much as it is, it could be that, but as much as it is that Poseidon, the god of the sea, was upset with you and capsized your boat because you didn't offer the right homage to him when you walked onto the port, and you didn't offer the sacrifice. You were rushed, and so he took offense to that, and he reacted. He sank your boat. So a lot of ancients, I think, would have had this sense of vindictiveness to the gods. They're not necessarily there for your benefit. They're ones to be appeased. So I find this interesting as we read through the New Testament a lot, right? There's these famous passages about God's wrath, right? Of God being angry at some level, right? So the wrath of God is revealed, Romans 1:18. I think for ancients that Paul was working with, right, that would have been the part that they probably went, well, yeah, we know gods are angry, right? That's what gods are wrathful. We see their wrath in the world. For Paul's audience, what might have been more surprising is as they read through Romans, they get to Romans 5, verse 1, and it says, we now therefore have peace with God. So the idea of wrath was commonplace. The idea of having peace or being at good terms with the divine being was probably the more new or novel thought there in Paul's day of that. And so as they thought about the gods, they had these deities for everything. The home had deities. I have some pictures here in a minute. But every home had an altar in the back kind of corner, sectioned off. If you go to Pompeii or any kind of Roman archaeological site and into a home, you'll see the home gods. So it comes from the most basic level of your home all the way up to the empire and to cities. As I mentioned last week, the highest religious office in the ancient world is the emperor. Augustus, Claudius, Tiberius, Nero, along with being the most important political figure, right, is also known as the Pontifex Maximus, the high priest of the Roman Empire. And it was actually the emperor's responsibility for allowing new religions in and kicking religions out. They held kind of the gavel, if you were, on that, on giving someone a legal status as a religion or an illegal status. And so we have stories of and we'll look at some of these in a minute, of emperors kicking religions out because they're considered too subversive, or checking them out and saying, okay, we're going to add that one to the kind of panoply of religions that we worship here in Rome. Rome was very kind of, I don't say, monstrous in that way. They were always consuming more gods, right? They were always adding to that to bring stability and control. And so as Romans imagine the religious landscape, this is perhaps the most different point from us, is that when Paul's working with ancient communities in Rome, Thessalonica, or Ephesus, they're all believing in the divine, right? They're all polytheists at this level. And Paul, of course, comes at this as a monotheist, so that's his kind of argument, right? How do we say there's only one God in the world, not many? We, of course, live in a very different world where we have atheism, right? The belief that maybe God doesn't exist. That's not really a common belief in the ancient world. Atheists aren't really actually at all present. In fact, the groups that are called atheists are typically Jews and Christians because they don't believe in enough gods, right? The term atheism actually doesn't mean no God. In Greek, the alpha primitive there at the beginning negates what comes next. And so you could translate it against the gods. In many ways, Jews and Christians were viewed as atheists, quote unquote, because they were against the gods. They weren't supporting, right, the Persian, Greek, Roman deities. And so they were kind of the first atheists, right, if you will, because they didn't believe in the panoply of all those things. In fact, there is a weird kind of accident, you might say, of history, that the rise of Christianity actually paved the way for kind of modern day atheism because it provided a stepping stone, right? It's pretty hard to swing from polytheism, multiple gods, to no gods. What Christianity inadvertently did was bring into question. So it went from there aren't many gods to what if there's no God at all? And so Christianity, ironically enough, provided a small philosophical stepping stone. By questioning the God's existence, you actually raise a bigger question, right? Does God exist itself? And so Christians find themselves, and Paul found himself, in a very different world where he's not having to argue for people believing in multiple divine beings, or in a divine being at all. That's just part and parcel of the ancient world. In fact, right, in Genesis 1, in the beginning God, right? That's the first lines. There's no kind of philosophical explanation to prove a divine being. It's just taken for granted. Let me pause it there. As you think about that with the Roman world, any thoughts or questions on how the ancients would be interacting with them? What their beliefs would have encompassed? Yeah.
So, Christian belief, or at least early Christian belief, included belief that, Jesus himself called the devil the god of this world, and then the demons, these sub-demonic beings.
Mm-hmm.
Were they associated with these gods?
Yeah, so we have kind of like divine beings, like in terms of like God, capital G, but then we also have a lot of like just malevolent forces. Paul will typically categorize these as powers and principalities. There's somehow lesser divine beings, but kind of in concert with. So even, show you a picture in a minute, even Venus, right, has Cupid, right? So we're coming up on Valentine's Day. Cupid is Venus's son, and it's a lesser deity, but related to Venus. And so yeah, you would have a multiple aspect. in terms of ancient kind of Jewish belief and early Christian, there is the acknowledgement of other divine forces in the world. That's kind of a ongoing conversation in the Old Testament that I think gets more crystallized as we go through. And of course, the early Christians are going to make a claim that Jesus is incorporated into that divine identity.
But the word divine is confusing if you apply it to demonic beings.
Mm-hmm.
But so they're just not human.
Yeah, they're supernatural.
They're
Yeah.
superhuman.
Superhuman. Yeah. Yeah, and those are usually malevolent forces kind of at work in the world to kind of wreak havoc. And so, Paul will even in 1 Corinthians talk about daemons, right, in the temples, of these kind of negative spiritual forces that, from Paul's point of view, abuse people, get them confused, persuade them wrongly. So that's what kind of his admonitions is: don't kind of play in that area, because there's other forces at work in the world. Again, for many modern people, we come at it from the opposite perspective, right? Where they would have seen multiple supernatural kind of elements to their world. That's a great question. Yeah.
I just wanted to make sort of an observation as you were talking about there's a God for that, there's an app for that. In the Catholic Church, there's a saint for that. And you can,
Yeah.
and I know people who pray to
Yep.
saints.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, they're not malevolent.
Yes.
But for their aid and help.
Yeah.
And they're kind of like sub-deities in there.
Yeah, I think the powerful thing that we could be convinced of is that there is not an area of our life that should be untouched by God. I think that's something that the ancients would have intuitively grasped. We have to sometimes be convinced that God cares and concerns about all aspects of our life. And so you see that kind of maybe human impulse to want to make sure all of life is attuned to the reality of the divine, not just Sunday morning or worship. That's something that the ancients would probably be a little bit farther ahead of us in terms of that. Great. As we continue, so two kind of concepts for Roman religion, and we have English words for these, and you're going to hear them, right? We get pietas and religio. And pietas is the sense of doing one's obligations and following the rites most closely, whatever the priest tells you to do. And religio comes along with that, and it's how the level of concern you have for doing it rightly. So do you pay attention to your pietas? Are you concerned with saying the right prayer, doing the right sacrifice, seeking out the God's favor? If you don't, you have bad religio. You're kind of unconcerned with your pietas. But pietas, where we get our word piety, right, from that, is that kind of concept of, am I pursuing the gods and doing the things that I need to do rightly? So one of the things that makes religion in the ancient world is, you can kind of sum it up in three things. They have priests, temples, and sacrifices. Those are three kind of common things that all religions have in the ancient Near East. They have a sacred space, they have sacred people, and then they have sacred activities, right, in those places. And so this is where pietas comes in. Am I encountering those sacred spaces in the right way? In fact, even ancient Judaism and ancient Israelite religion corresponds to this, right? They have a temple, they have priests, and they offer sacrifices, right? Every religion does this in the ancient world. This is what in some ways makes the early Jesus movement so peculiar. In a way, they want to be known as a religious institution, as a way of life, but they don't have, in some sense, temples, priests, or sacrifices, right? They have house churches that Paul will use temple language to describe, but they don't have an actual temple that they go to after 70. They don't offer actual sacrifices. Paul will say in Romans 12:1, your body is your living sacrifice. And then priests, that one gets a little complicated, but they have this idea that they're all priests unto God, the classic reformational priesthood of all believers, right? And so in some sense, the early Jesus group stands out of sorts in that way, because it is moving in different circles, right? And so they don't have those kind of telltale signs of religious way of life in the ancient world. In fact, as Paul has remarked upon, and you see this a little bit in Athens, notice that he's approached by philosophers that come to him, Stoics and Epicureans, because he looks like he's offering a new way of life, ethics. And one of the things we're going to see of ancient religion is that they're not really concerned with morals and morality. That's the domain of philosophers. And so in some ways, the early Jesus groups look more like philosophical communities than they do ancient religions. Because they're centered on someone's teachings. They're following the teachings of an important individual. And they're trying to pattern their life after a teacher. So in the ancient world, that looks more like a philosophy than it does a religion, per se. Of course, Paul is saying they're doing both. But from an outside point of view, that's what they would look like, especially without a temple in that. And so these three things begin to make Roman religion. As you go into the temple of Aphrodite or Poseidon or Zeus, are you going to go to the priest and ask for the prayer? Are you going to follow it closely? Are you going to offer your sacrifice with a sense of devotion and gratitude? These are what kind of dominate good and bad religion in the Roman world. Yeah, we have that there. So temples are everywhere in the Roman world. I want to give you a picture. Augustus brags that when he takes over and becomes emperor, he actually restores 82 temples in Rome. He refurbished them, he rebuilds them. Again, in his role as Pontifex Maximus, his job is to bring stability to the empire, especially after a civil war, right? And so he does that by showing his kind of bona fides by restoring temples. He's going to bring peace to the city. And so this is the Palatine Hill in Rome, and those little blue dots these are all temples. And so the Roman religious landscape was just dotted with these things. One of the more famous ones, of course, is the one on the screen. This is in Rome, of course. And if you've ever been there, right, remember you walk in, you have a rotunda, right? And in each of the little porticos would have been a Roman deity, right? And so this is where you could go to worship. Early Christians take this over and they refurbish it and make it a Christian church somewhere in the second to third century, I think. So they kind of repurpose this. And we find Christians doing this a lot as the empire grows and Christians become a majority. They actually overtake pagan temples and refurbish them. There's no reason to tear them down and rebuild, right? You already have the structure there. So they kind of Christianize them in a way and make them temples to Jesus. So you see a lot of this kind of going on in the Roman world. Let me give us some quick kind of characteristics. I want to highlight a couple of these and how they would have worked out practically for ancient Romans. So Roman religion is not exclusive just by its very definition of polytheism, right? If there's a God for every aspect of human life, the goal is to worship as many as possible, right? You probably don't want to reduce that number unless there's an area of your life that you don't really care about, right? And so you were encouraged to worship multiple deities. In fact, you better be if you want your life to go well. They believe strongly in the power of fate. So fate is also a god. Providence is what this is called sometimes. That determines the outcome and course of actions in human lives. And this has a profound effect on how the ancients thought about people. Primarily this idea of change. Can you become a different person? Can you be someone else? Can you turn over a new leaf, to put in modern language? The ancients would largely say no, because the gods have determined who you're going to be. So in Stoic philosophy, right, the idea is we'll find out who you are over time. You might be able to fake it for a little while and be a good person, but if you ultimately are not a good person, that will be revealed. And so when the early Jesus followers come around talking about this idea of change, it's actually rather new. We look at it with the word conversion, right? Can you convert? Can you, in Paul's language, become a new creation, right? That kind of strikes against this idea of fate in the Roman world, that you can become someone different. And I think it largely begins to open up new pathways for growth and for opportunity in terms of one's demographics don't determine their destiny for the early Jesus movement. It doesn't matter if they were born enslaved, they could be freed, right? It doesn't matter if they were born in this place and not a Roman citizen, that didn't affect their identity. And so this idea of fate actually comes to have quite profound moral implications for the Roman world, particularly in social domains of poverty, enslavement, control, because in some ways this is the dictation of the gods. And so there are deities around wealth, right? There's a god of luck, fortune, Tyche. And so poverty takes on this really interesting domain where if you're looking at someone who's down on their luck, that's just not an economic problem. It's not just a personal quote unquote problem. It's a divine response. Fate and fortune have forsaken that person. The gods have forsaken them. That's why they're impoverished. And so this comes to have a knock-on effect towards Roman, or the lack of, Roman charity. Why should you help someone out if the gods aren't helping them out? Like, their position in life is dictated by the gods. And so if you want to help someone come out of poverty, the rationale for that is pretty thin because the gods have already declared that over someone's life. And so it's really Jews and Christians that get known for their almsgiving, for their charity, because they're not holding to this belief. But I think it gives the early Jesus followers this potential that I think we really latch onto today, that the world as we see it may not be the world that God intended. And that's oddly different from the ancients. Because as they look out at fate, the way the world is the way that the gods have set it up. This is the way the gods want the world to function. And the early Christians, by kind of pushing back on this, say, wait a second, we believe that there's brokenness in the world, that death is at work in the world, so what we see may not be fully God's intention, and that gives the early Jesus followers and Jews the opportunity to work for change. We're saying we actually might need to change things in our world, because fate isn't declaring all of these things. And so fate's a big one. In light of that, astrology and magic actually become pretty popular. Looking at the stars, manipulating physical forces of the world, because you're trying to find out how the world works. And this is perhaps the most difficult one for us to grasp, because we know so much about our world, right? From science and technology, we have attempted to tame, right, the natural world. In the ancient world, there's a lot that's murky, there's a lot that's scary, there's a lot that's unknown. And so the idea of looking to the stars, looking to the gods, using magic becomes quite popular. Some have looked at the book of Acts in some ways as a discourse on Christianity versus magic. You meet a couple magicians through the book of Acts, and in many ways there's a battle here for who's more powerful in the world, who's actually going to overcome. In fact, even in the Gospels, right, you get a sense of that when Jesus is questioned on his miracles. Notice the question is not, do miracles exist, right, because they're ancient people, right, but rather, by what power do you do these things? And their response is, it's from the power of the dark side, right? We're not questioning that you're pulling off miracles and that you are doing things. We're questioning on who's sourcing your power. Is it Yahweh, or is it the dark forces of the world? And so in many ways, the ancient world, especially Greco-Roman, was attuned to magic, of saying we can do really interesting things. And this becomes a contest, right, in the book of Acts with the apostles and the healings. The last two I think are probably the most important before we look at some fun pictures. One is that the corporate nature of religion. So we're all in this together. It's kind of the ancient mindset. And you see this in that story I referenced earlier with Acts 19 in Ephesus. Right? The silver artisans are upset, the silversmiths, because they say if this continues, if they forsake the temples, the entire city is going to face the divine wrath of Artemis. She's going to lash out on all of us, not just the Christians, but on the entire city. And so many cities, empires, looked at religion as social cohesion in some way. Because when the gods lash out, they're not very strategic, right? It's just a kind of a curse on all your houses, right? Everyone bears the brunt of an angry deity, especially if one like Artemis or a local deity. And so the idea is that our beliefs, and this is the part where I think we actually learn from the ancients, is that our beliefs actually do impinge upon one another. Our religious beliefs actually do have effects on people in our neighborhoods. The ancients deeply understood that what the early Jesus followers were doing was going to have effects on their livelihoods from their vantage point. So of course we live in a much different world, again, a recent human experiment on the separation of church and state, right, on quote unquote privatized religious belief, because we face a new dilemma. How do we exercise religion in the public square, with competing values. In the ancient world, they realized it's just there. And so how do we do that? So early Jesus followers run into conflict over that because their beliefs are impinging upon the overall beliefs. It's not just, well, that's a cute belief you Christians have over there. Just go in your own house churches and do what you want to do. They would say, no, that worship is actually impinging upon our social reality. And so we're gonna use a couple things at our disposal, either social malignment, economic disenfranchisement, or even flat out persecution, right? To get you back into the fold. So either you're gonna become part of the team, or you're not gonna need to be on the team because you're gonna be dead, right? And so that's kind of the mindset in the ancient world, is that it's corporate, where all of our beliefs are working together as a whole, and we can't section off this little thing over here because it has implications. And you see that all throughout the New Testament. People are saying, wait a second, what these Jesus followers are doing affects us all, especially from a Greco-Roman mindset. And so that would be a stark difference from some of the ways in which we talk about religious experience in our own modern world, which is, as long as your belief doesn't affect anyone, feel free to believe whatever you want. The ancients do not have that mindset at all. They fully believe that what you believe and what you practice is going to affect the whole. And that's where I think we can learn a little bit. The last one, before a pause here, is that ancient religion is not focused on morality in the Greco-Roman world, i.e. the gods are not concerned with what you do with your life in that sense. They're interested in prayers and sacrifices. They're not interested in the categories of right and wrong, good and evil, moral, immoral. That's not the domain of religion or priests. It's, as I mentioned earlier, the domain of philosophers in the ancient world. So it's the Stoics, the Epicureans, they're the ones talking about morality, good and evil, good, better, best, the good life. And so as Paul comes along and he's talking about moral categories, right, he looks much more like that Roman philosopher than he does a Roman priest in that sense. And so if you want kind of advice on how to live your life in the ancient world, you actually don't go to a priest, you go to a philosopher. And that's largely how you learn to live and attain what the ancients called the good life, happiness. What does a life look like that you can be proud of? That's a philosophical conversation in the ancient world, not a religious one per se. And so this gets to have many different interesting implications for the early Jesus movement, because as they are practicing, obviously, religion, right? Jews and obviously Israelites before them have a long history of connecting right beliefs about God with right living, right? Ethics was a deep part, right, of the Hebrew Bible. And so Jews and Christians kind of stand out of sync with that in terms of religion. They've always been connecting those two, of how one lives is a reflection of God. And so for many other ancients, this would be a new thing. Hence why in all of Paul's letters, you see him dealing with moral problems in religious communities, because they wouldn't have connected those two things, right? They would have said, well, I'm just going to worship this deity and then I can do whatever I want outside. And Paul says, time out, not so fast. Let me introduce you to Yahweh, right, who's deeply concerned with how you're living your everyday life. So that would have been one of the stark contrasts. Here's that list, just real quickly. I know it's a little small on the screen. I wish I could zoom a little bit. But just notice the list of deities. There's Greek and Roman names, because a lot of these are domains of just life. And so as Romans encountered new gods, they would just kind of capitalize them, right? They would take them and cannibalize them, into their own thing. Say, oh, you call it that, we call that this, and collapse, right? Because they all have farms, they all have seas, they all have mountains, right? And so some of that is a collapsing of them. But often Rome would incorporate new deities. They actually had this, I think, rather arrogant process where when they were about to conquer another people group, a city, they would actually have a whole religious procession where they would call out the gods of that city to come over to their side and then go attack the city. And so say, hey, we're the Romans. These guys are really going to like us, so come on over to our team. And then they would go sack the city. And so they were always kind of merging gods in. But take a look at the list. We can chat about some of them. I have a couple pictures of some of them to kind of give some flesh to the bones here as we move to the second portion. Any thoughts or questions on that aspect? Yeah, Jonathan?
In the Greco-Roman world, how many
Yeah, I think it probably trends that way. That philosophy, because many people just don't have time. I mean, they're working 12, 14-hour days. I mean, just subsistence living. There's not the time to obviously read and reflect or go to a lecture, right? Life is much more hard and difficult in that sense. And so I think, yeah, it's not really for the masses in that way. Although the Stoics and Epicureans have a little bit broader reach. But philosophy, of course, was the third level of education. So if you're really elite, right, you get your own personal philosopher to study with, right? Alexander the Great had Aristotle. Marcus Aurelius will have his own. Nero has Seneca, right? So yeah, it's very much oriented towards the top of the pyramid. But you do have someone like Epictetus, who's a moral philosopher that, in really interesting ways, forms communities of not just male, because they typically tend to be male, but male and female, slave and free. At a distance, he writes letters to them. He nicknames his communities the Garden. And so he'll actually write letters to them about their way of life. It's very similar to what Paul's doing. It's probably the closest analogy. But that's Epictetus. He's probably out of the orbit. He would actually form communities around the Greco-Roman world and correspond with them. But yeah, most people aren't looking for that because religion is on the street, right? So there's a temple, and you just walk in and offer a little prayer or sacrifice. Religion's going to function for most of that, for most of your average people. Yep.
Can you just speak briefly about the relationship between Hecate and her Roman counterpart in today's English word trivia?
Trivia, yeah. Yeah, so I think there's a sense here, so this would be like kind of the god of magic. Sometimes they cover sometimes a wide domain of territories, and so even the crossroads there is interesting because one of the things that Augustus did was increase participation in religion. So he put little altars at the crossroads of every like intersection in the city of Rome, so that people could walk by and just participate. And he allowed lay people to kind of like participate in that. You didn't have to be a priest. And so this is the domain of the intersections of life, of magic, of everyday living. And so I guess maybe the word trivia is like the anecdotal piece to that, of the et cetera, right, of life. Might be that connection there. I haven't studied that one as in depth, but it is interesting because, you know, who doesn't love a good trivia night, right? But they may be doing something a little bit different than that. I don't think we're worshiping pagan deities in that.
But our English word does come from that Roman
I think so,
goddess
yeah.
name?
Yeah, it's probably the et cetera, the unknown pieces of that. Yeah.
I appreciate the point you made about the Roman power of fate
Yeah.
versus the Jesus movement power to change the world.
Yeah.
So tomorrow, as we celebrate the life and legacy of Dr. Martin Luther King Jr., what can we learn from the early Jesus movement? Because from what you said, the Romans said the rich are rich and the poor are poor, and that's just the way it is.
Yep.
But something about the Jesus movement is different. And
Yeah.
so what is that?
Yeah, I think, no, that's a great reminder. I mean, yeah, we live in the aftermath of people living out these really distinct beliefs. And I think one, obviously, of the level of ethnicity, right? So there are, most religions in the ancient world, we should have mentioned, are ethnic-based, right, religions. It's the god of a people group. And so when you have religious conflict, you also have ethnic conflict, right? And so when it's, and you even see this in, like, it's the God of Israel, right? It's Israel's God. That's the Roman conception. That's who they worship down there in Israel in ancient Judea. We don't worship that God. We're Romans. We're Egyptians. We're Babylonians, right? We all have our gods, and when we get in our war conflicts, right, those aren't just political military battles. They're also divine battles, right? And much of the Old Testament is offering answers for why did Jerusalem fall? What does that say? I mean, Jeremiah, in some sense, is asking the question, what does that say about Yahweh? Is he weak, right? Are the Babylonian gods more powerful? And so I think in religion, right, we get this place of it's also ethnic, right? The Babylonians are ethnically superior to these other groups because they're running the world. And that gets even more amplified with the Romans, right? And so I think what you have with the Jesus movement, right, is this way of looking at the world that's fundamentally different. I think, obviously through the Hebrew Bible, there's a profound strand of brokenness and death, and the idea of restoration, right? That God's going to restore the world, which carries the implicit idea that it's not the way it should be, right? Because obviously the early Jesus followers experienced this on a profound level in their communities, a la Galatians 3:28, right? That in the Messiah there is no longer Jew nor Greek, male nor female, slave nor free, for you are all equal, you are all one in Christ Jesus. And that kind of cross-section that's how the Roman world broke themselves up. Ethnic-based, gender, and status. And so the early Jesus followers offered a profound challenge to literally the way the world was organized, by who was meeting in the room. And for the early Jesus followers, this became, I think, that odd word, a form of evangelism, right? As they looked in on these worshiping communities, they couldn't explain it from a sociological perspective. They didn't use that term. But they would say, okay, what are all these ethnicities doing in this room? Why are there men and women in the room? Why are women teaching? Why are enslaved persons in the room people who are enslaving people? This is very confusing from the outside. But it actually gave the early Jesus followers an opportunity to say, let me tell you a story. And they're off to the races talking about Jesus of Nazareth. And so the very makeup of the community becomes the pathway for the conversation about Jesus. Because many religious groups in the ancient world were ethnic, gender, or status-based. So you have the silversmiths of Artemis in Ephesus. Probably all male, probably all residents of Ephesus, so all Greek in that sense, right? And they're not incorporating like, hey, we should broaden our group. They're not doing that. And so the very makeup of the early Jesus communities, I think, offered that reality, and it was about that challenging that power of fate. That maybe this isn't the way that God would set things up, and what if He's actually revealed? Actually, this isn't the way He wants things set up, right? So they looked at the care for the orphan, the poor, the widow. And so, okay, if God has a deep concern for the most vulnerable in society, that must mean He thinks differently about them, right? So I think they're theologically rationalizing their practices to say, well, our God says something different about these groups. Because you don't have a lot of Roman sources. You have a lot of Roman sources talking about the poor, but it's very much in what they call a textualized way. So it's really rich people talking about poor people. And they have all the same arguments that we hear today, right? Poverty is a result of personal choices. They didn't manage their money well. And then they also have a trump card, the gods, right? And so it's really interesting to go back and see their arguments for why poverty exists. They just add a religious element to it. Yeah, others have come along and said this changes the world. And that really is one of the things that the early Jesus followers did. We see these people coming out of temples in the ancient world. And right before he passed away, there was a scholar named Larry Hurtado, and he wrote a book called Destroyer of the Gods. It's done by Baylor Press in 2019. But basically said that the early Jesus followers were essentially setting depth charges underneath all of the Roman deities, and within a century, they had imploded, right? And this goes back to, it's been somewhat criticized, but the sociologist Rodney Stark, I may have shared this last week. I can't remember if I did. I'm teaching New Testament right now at Gordon, and so sometimes my lectures overlap. But Rodney Stark, he kind of quipped and said, the early Christians outlived, outloved, and outthought their opposition in the first century. So they outthought them. They put their great philosophical resources to bear on saying that the Jesus movement can stand on its own 2 feet philosophically. It's not a flight into fancy. Great theologians did immense philosophical work to kind of defend that in a polytheistic context. They outloved their neighbors, so they cared for the poor, they took care of widows and orphans, picked up babies off of trash heaps. They outloved their neighbors, and then they outlived them. They died. They were martyred, right? So we even have Pliny writing to Trajan. I think he's writing about Bithynia, and he says, we're killing the Christians. It's not stopping. They're not recanting. Do you have anything else we can try? Right? So Christians were willingly going to their deaths, and the sword wouldn't stop and get them to recant. And so Rodney Stark says that the early Jesus followers changed the world by outthinking, outloving, and outliving their opposition. I forget his name, but he wrote a book called The Patient Ferment of the Early Church. Kruger, I think is his name. He said that the early church took the long view. So not thinking in days, months, or even years, but thinking in centuries. And saying that this might be a longer story that we're telling here. And so how do we remain faithful if we don't see the immediate effects of what we're doing? But what if we look a century ahead? What are the things that we're doing to be the type of kingdom that God wants us to be? So those are all very practical ways that I think they embodied that. We are running a little bit out of time. I want to show a couple of different pictures. So this is the ways that ancients would have encountered the group. So from sculptures, from temples. This is Dionysius or Bacchus. This one is always fun to talk about with students because this is the god of the party. And so this one I think is rather fun. This is the god of wine. If you could zoom in closer, you would see around Bacchus he has some grapes around his neck. This is the god Hope, peace, right? God of hope. So when you put the image together, it's hope for a good time, right? That's what that image is kind of communicating. And what's fascinating about Dionysius or Bacchus is this is one of the cults that's actually kicked out of Rome by Julius Caesar for excessive partying. So they get in trouble for rioting and brawls because, and this will make sense in a minute, you worship your god, this god. This god shows up when you are very intoxicated, right? And so the goal of encountering Dionysius is you encounter him in that kind of ephemeral state between sobriety and not sobriety. That's when the god appears. So essentially these were large drinking parties where people would come in and just get massively drunk. And then that's when they believed they were worshiping their god. And then you can imagine what happens after that. People tend not to make great decisions. And so Julius Caesar ends up kicking them out for a decade, right at the end of the Republic, because he says, if you guys keep it up, you're going to like knock down the city, right? And so this cult actually gets banished. I do find this one interesting for the New Testament. So imagine this is a god that you worship. You worship Zeus, maybe you're a great, Dionysius, maybe you're a grape grower, or you just like to party. And you meet Paul in the Agora in Corinth. You hear about Jesus. He says, come down to Chloe's house on Sunday. That's where the house church meets. Or maybe Phoebe's house in Cenchrea on the east side. You walk into the room, and at the end of the room, you see a table, and you see a loaf of bread and a bottle of wine. What do you think you're going to do? How do you think you're going to react? You're going to walk in and go, oh, I know how this goes, right? Pass the bottle, right? This may be why Paul has to write them and says, why do some of you go ahead and get drunk, key word there, while others of you are starving and don't have enough? Don't you know that this is not how Jesus is worshipped? But you can begin to see why it would be confusing. If wine was a part of your religious experience of a god, and the early Christians are having that in their Eucharist meal, it's not a large leap to say, oh, well, I know how this works. And so a lot of Paul's work with Gentiles, non-Jewish people, is a kind of re-education in a way. This is how Yahweh wants to be worshipped. It's not like those gods. It's like this. So there's Dionysius. We have Venus. We'll skip over that. This is one of the most popular ones of the wives of emperors, actually. This was like the patrona, right, of Roman emperor wives. She has a son named Cupid. We are coming up on Valentine's Day. Despite all of the marketing, in the ancient world, he is not a cute and cuddly figure. He's actually a very bad person. He's the one that gives bad impulses, bad desires to people. And so the domains of affairs and things like that, kind of the idea is Cupid made me do it, right? He shot me with his bow and gave me kind of a thought that I didn't think through, and I acted on it, right? And so that's a way that, the gods affect every aspect. Mars, this one's really important for Rome, obviously. It's the god of war. So there's an area in Rome even today called the Campus Martius area, where the Temple of Mars would have been. And before every battle, before the Romans would out, the general and the soldiers would go down with the emperor to Mars's temple and offer a sacrifice. And they would touch the end of Mars's spear for good luck as they went out. And so obviously as the Romans think about it, they go, Mars really loves us, along with the god of Nike, victory, because look around. We're ruling the world. If Mars didn't want it, why are we winning so many battles? Right? Why are we the biggest empire the world has ever seen? And so This one is really significant, and that's why for the first, 300 years, the early Jesus followers didn't participate in the military because they viewed it as polytheistic. They'd have to worship another deity. And they said, we can't worship Jesus and participate in the Roman military because it's going to be a conflict of allegiances there. So that one gets really problematic for someone like, say, Cornelius, who's a Roman soldier that we meet in Acts 10, right? What does it look like for a Roman soldier to come to faith? You serve a 25-year term with the Romans in the army before you're let out, right? And so what does that look like to become a Jesus follower? How do you participate? These are some of the big questions that Jesus followers are going to have to answer. The last one I want to do right before we finish is, I think, fun. So this is the god Asclepius. This is the god of healing. He originates from the island of Kos. This is his healing temple. They were known as Asclepions in the ancient world. These are really popular. They're kind of like med spas. And it's where you went to go have problems fixed. So there's a god that you can pray to for healing. Right? In the ancient world, if a body part isn't working or you broke a limb. And so you could go there, and these were, again, kind of like med spas. This is a picture I took in Coast in 2015. Really gorgeous. And we found lots of archaeological artifacts there. So these are all body parts. I won't zoom in on any of them because this is adult formation hour. But people would essentially make plaster casts of anything that was ailing them and then put it into the temple to be prayed over at night by the priest of Asclepius to hopefully be healed. And so we have legs, arms, torsos, other body parts. These are actually ancient depictions of the uterus, of wombs. And so probably infertility at some level of what's being prayed over here. Obviously they didn't make an actual plaster cast, they manufacture it, right? But these are all body parts, and the idea is you want to be healed. And so you give that to the gods and you pray for healing. And so we see that even right in the Jesus stories. Praying to Jesus saying, heal me if you can, heal me. Because again, without the advent of modern medicine and science, right, there's a lot that goes wrong in the ancient world. And so there are gods for that. The fun story I have about this one is that when I was there, I learned two things. One, so you would spend the night there, and you would sleep in these like chambers, and we have ancient texts that say that the priests were piping in hallucinogenic drugs into the sleeping chambers. So you can only imagine how breakfast was the next morning, right? Like, hey, how was your night? How'd you sleep? You won't believe what happened, right? And they would share these stories of these like magical experiences, and they were just really tripping on mushrooms, right? So that's one piece, which is hilarious. The other piece is that they would actually gatekeep this. And so if you came up to the temple and you looked a little worse for wear, they actually wouldn't let you in. And if you were there and you took a turn for the worse, they would actually take you out into the woods to die. I joke morbidly that your Yelp review is kind of contingent on this, right? It's not good for the healing health spa if someone dies on site. So they got 5 out of 5 stars, but they are not like treating people like if you look sick, they're going to keep you at bay, right? Of course, yeah, so this is the way that ancients would have thought about healing. So all the healings in the book of Acts, the Gospels, Paul talks about healings in his letters. This is their background. There's a God for that. And so again, who is more powerful, Yahweh or these deities? All right, the point I want to end on before we have some questions is what does it look like if you live in this world and the gods narrate every domain of human life? What does conversion to Jesus look like? I think one of the things that we tend to underestimate, that if we could for a minute step into those shoes and believe that world to be true, right? That there are gods that affect every single aspect of your life. To turn your back on them, I think we tend to underestimate the level of anxiety, fear, and stress there would have been for any early Gentile Jesus follower. Because as the sky is blue, those gods are real. Everyone in your community believes those gods are real. And you're saying, I'm going to follow Jesus. I'm going to turn my back on those temples. Because again, the idea is if you're wrong, if Jesus isn't who he says he is, then you just tank your life and the life of everybody that you love. Your life is about to get really, really hard and really, really bad. So I think as we think about the early Jesus followers and their commitment to Jesus, it would have been, I think, a deeply profound thing to do that. And daily how you've been saying, I hope this is right. I hope for my family's sake that Jesus is who he says he is. And this may give us a little bit of insight on one of Paul's most favorite terms that he uses all throughout his letters, that we probably just read over in some ways really quickly. It's the term pistis that we translate faith. Paul uses it over 120 times in his letters. And we typically think of pistis as like faith as belief, like I believe in God. But more, a better translation of that, as we've looked at sources, is that the word pistis should actually be translated trust or faithfulness. And the question in the ancient world, especially with Roman religion, is who do you trust? Where's your faith? Who is your faith in? Is it in these gods, or is it in Jesus of Nazareth? And I think that's why Paul is constantly returning this question of faithfulness, of who's your loyalty, who's your utmost loyalty? Where does those allegiances lie? And so all his faith language is, I think, deeply rooted in a group that left one way of living, and as Paul says, turn from idols to serve the living God. In that one sentence, he's narrated quite the experience for his Gentiles who are leaving behind the world that they know and walking in faith and trust that Jesus is who he says he is. So I think that's why, and I think even for today, right, that's the question. Who do we trust? Where's our loyalty? Who provides salvation, safety, and security for our lives? We have just as many tests on that as the ancients do. It may not be Zeus and Venus, but the gods of power, sex, and money are still around. And they're also calling for that loyalty. They're calling for that faithfulness. So I think Paul's word to us would be one of the same. Let me finish with that for now. Any thoughts or questions on parts of that? I know we're going to start worship here in a little bit.
This is so great, Jason. Thank you so much.
You're welcome. Thank you.